The wind had a voice out here, a lonely thing that spoke in long, sighing whispers through the sun-bleached grass of the high plains. It was a language Thaddius Bell understood, a dialect of solitude he'd been fluent in for the 2 years since Martha was laid to rest on the low hill overlooking their homestead. The silence that followed the wind was different. It was a heavy, watchful quiet, a stillness that had grown teeth in the last few weeks. The source of that malignant silence and the focus of its attention was the old barn, and the only one who seemed to see it for what it was the dog. Pastor, a mix of something shepherd-like and something older, wilder, was no ordinary animal. He was a creature of preternatural intuition, a four-legged barometer for the pressures of the unseen world. In the happy times, when Martha's laugh still echoed from the porch and the air tasted of bread and hope, Pastor was a shadow of lolling tongue and easy contentment at Thaddeus's heel. Now, he was a statue carved from brindle fur and fear. For 3 weeks, the dog had held a vigil. Every morning he would forego his usual circuit of the property, ignore the scent of rabbits in the sagebrush, and plant himself 50 yards from the great weathered doors of the barn. He wouldn't bark, he wouldn't whine. He would simply stand, rigid as a fence post, head lowered, the hackles on his thick neck permanently raised, and stare. His gaze was a physical thing, a line of force drawn between his burning amber eyes, and a place just inside the shadowed maw of the barn that Thaddeus couldn't see. At first, Thaddeus had tried to break the spell. He'd called, cajoled, even thrown a piece of dried jerky in the opposite direction. Pastor wouldn't flinch. His entire being was focused on that single point of dread. Thaddeus had walked the barn's perimeter, checked the locks, peered through the dusty slats into the familiar gloom. He saw only what he always saw: stacked bales of hay losing their scent to time, the rusted skeleton of an old plow, Martha's gardening tools hanging in a neat row, just as she'd left them. Nothing was out of place, yet the feeling was undeniable. The air inside was cold, colder than it should be, and carried a faint, cloying sweetness underneath the dry smell of dust and decay. It was the smell of wrongness. Tonight, the unease was a physical weight in Thaddeus's chest. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the vast, empty sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. The wind had died down, leaving a vacuum that amplified every small sound. The creak of the porch swing where he sat, the frantic buzz of a trapped moth against the window pane, the unnerving stillness of his dog. Pastor hadn't moved in hours. He was a dark silhouette against the fading light, a sentinel guarding against a nameless threat. Thaddeus ran a calloused hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble a familiar friction. He was a man weathered by sun and sorrow, his face a roadmap of long days and longer nights. His hands, thick and scarred from a life of ranching, felt clumsy and useless against this invisible siege. He could mend a fence, break a horse, birth a calf in a blizzard, but he didn't know how to fight a feeling. He missed Martha with an ache that was as constant as his own heartbeat. She would have known what to do. She had a way of seeing the truth of things, of smoothing the frayed edges of his world with a touch or a word. "It's just the wind, Thad," he could almost hear her say, her voice a warm memory against the encroaching chill. But he knew it wasn't the wind. The dog knew. The dog was her parting gift. When Martha was in her final weeks, her world shrinking to the confines of their bed, the stray had appeared at their doorstep, a half-starved creature with wise, old eyes. Martha had named him Pastor, because he's come to guide you when I can't. Thaddeus had scoffed at the time, but now the name felt like a prophecy. Pastor had been his anchor in the sea of grief, a living, breathing reason to get out of bed in the morning. Their bond was forged in the silent language of shared loss. And that was why this new behavior was so deeply unsettling. The dog wasn't just spooked, he was terrified, and his terror was a contagion, seeping into the soil of the ranch, poisoning the quiet peace Thaddeus had fought so hard to reclaim. He rose from the swing, the wood groaning in protest. He couldn't let it go on. He couldn't spend another night watching his only companion stare into an abyss he couldn't see. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the dusty earth. "All right, boy," he said, his voice rough. "All right, let's see what has you so spooked." Pastor didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him, but as Thaddius approached, a low growl rumbled deep in the dog's chest, a vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. It wasn't directed at him. It was a warning, a desperate plea aimed at the barn. Thaddius stopped beside him, placing a hand on the dog's rigid back. The muscles beneath the fur were knotted tight as coiled rope. He followed the dog's unwavering gaze, trying to see what he saw. The barn doors were slightly ajar, a blacker stripe of darkness in the twilight gloom. The smell was stronger here, the sickly, sweet note more pronounced. It was the smell of a secret, a bad one. He felt a prickle of fear, cold and sharp, on the back of his neck. This was his land, his home. He had built this barn with his own 2 hands, raised its frame against the endless sky. Martha had helped him, her hands small but strong on the timbers. It was a place of memories, of life and labor. Now, it felt like a tomb. The foreboding was no longer a vague premonition. It was a certainty, a heavy stone in his gut. Something was deeply, horribly wrong on his property, and whatever it was hiding in the dark. He walked past his frozen dog, his hand dropping to the worn handle of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. The familiar weight was a small comfort as he pushed the heavy barn door open and stepped into the suffocating darkness, leaving the last of the daylight behind. The interior of the barn was a cathedral of shadows. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the thin shafts of moonlight slanting through the cracks in the walls. The air was thick, stagnant, and cold. The sickly sweet smell was overwhelming now, a cloying perfume of rot that clung to the back of his throat. Thaddius stood just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. He scanned the familiar shapes, the hayloft ladder, the row of empty stalls, the workbench cluttered with tools. Nothing seemed disturbed. But Pastor hadn't been staring at the barn as a whole. His focus had been more specific. Thaddius stepped back outside, pulling the door wider to let in more of the bruised twilight. He walked around to the side of the building, Pastor trailing him for the first time in weeks, though the dog moved with a tense, low crouch, as if expecting an attack. Thaddius followed the dog's lead. Pastor didn't stop at the side wall. He rounded the back corner, his nose to the ground, his low growl a constant guttural hum. And then he stopped. He stood over a patch of earth a few feet from the barn's rear foundation. It was an area normally covered in weeds and stubborn prairie grass, but now the ground was different. It was a rough rectangle of disturbed soil, darker than the surrounding earth, the weeds torn away, the surface unevenly patted down. It looked fresh. A week, maybe 2. Someone had dug here. Thaddius stared at it, his mind refusing to make the logical leap. Coyotes? No. They wouldn't dig so neatly, so close to the barn. A runaway calf burying itself in the mud. Impossible. There was no mud. The truth was there, hovering just at the edge of his comprehension, a monstrous shape he didn't want to see. The smell was strongest here, rising from the broken ground like a foul exhalation. It was the smell of death. "No," he whispered, the words swallowed by the vast silence. Pastor whined, a high, thin sound of pure distress, and pawed at the edge of the disturbed patch. Thaddius felt a wave of nausea. He backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was not his business. This was a matter for the sheriff in town, a full day's ride away. He should get on his horse, ride hard, and let the law handle whatever this was. But the image of Pastor's 3-week vigil flashed in his mind. The dog's loyalty, his silent suffering. The animal had been living with this horror, trying to warn him, trying to communicate a truth his human senses were too dull to perceive. Thaddius couldn't just ride away. This violation, this desecration, was on his land, under the shadow of the barn he'd built with his wife. It felt personal. He took a deep, steadying breath, the foul air burning his lungs, and walked back into the barn. He returned moments later with a shovel, its iron edge scraping against the stone foundation. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he gripped the wooden handle. Pastor backed away, whining, as if he couldn't bear to watch. Thaddius ignored the churning in his stomach. He had to know, he had to see the face of this wrongness. He drove the shovel into the soft earth. The sound was obscene in the quiet, a wet, sucking noise. The soil came up easily, dark and loamy, mixed with the roots of torn grass. He tossed the first shovelful aside and dug again. And again. The work was grim, mechanical. With each scoop, the sweet, rotten smell intensified, becoming a physical presence that made his eyes water. He worked faster, driven by a terrible urgency, a need to get to the end of it. About 2 feet down, the shovel struck something soft but resilient. It wasn't a rock or a root. Thaddius froze, his knuckles white on the handle. He knelt, the damp earth cold against his knees, and scraped away the last layer of soil with his bare hands. His fingers brushed against a rough, coarse texture. Canvas, tightly wrapped and bound with rope. A tremor went through him, a violent shudder that started in his soul and worked its way out to his fingertips. It was a body. There was a body buried on his land, a human body wrapped like a piece of cargo. Bile rose in his throat, hot and acidic. He scrambled back, falling into a sitting position, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world seemed to tilt, the horizon swaying. Who? Why? Why here? The questions swarmed him, a cloud of hornets with no answers. It was in this moment of horrified paralysis that he heard it. The sound that always signaled a change in the weather of his world. Hoofbeats. Not the familiar, easy gait of a neighbor's horse, but the purposeful, steady rhythm of a rider approaching with intent. Thaddius's head snapped up. Coming over the low rise to the east was a single horse and rider, silhouetted against the last fiery remnants of the sunset. He knew that horse. He knew that rider. Ezra Crow, his nearest neighbor if you could call 5 miles of empty prairie near. Ezra was a man who wore his friendliness like a clean shirt, always ready with a wide smile and a question about the weather. He'd brought a stew over a few weeks after Martha died, an act of kindness Thaddius had appreciated at the time, but there was something in Ezra's eyes, a flickering calculation that never quite matched his easygoing demeanor. Thaddius had always kept a polite distance. Ezra rode into the yard and dismounted, his movements smooth and unhurried. He was a tall, lean man, his face clean-shaven, which was unusual out here. He looked more like a townsman than a rancher. He looped his reins around the porch railing and ambled toward the back of the barn, his smile already in place. "Thaddius, just thought I'd check in. Saw you from the ridge. Looked like you were putting in some late-night work," Ezra said, his voice a model of casual neighborliness. Then his eyes fell on the scene. Thaddius sitting on the ground, pale and shaken, the shovel lying beside him, the open, shallow grave with the edge of canvas showing. Ezra's smile didn't falter, but his eyes, sharp and dark as flint, hardened. The friendliness evaporated, leaving a chilling void. "Fixing a busted water pipe, are we?" he asked, but it wasn't a question. It was an accusation. His gaze was locked on the disturbed earth, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. Thaddius got to his feet slowly, brushing the dirt from his pants. His mind was racing. Ezra's arrival, at this exact moment, was too much of a coincidence. The pieces began to click into place with sickening speed. The fresh grave, the neighbor who just happened to be riding by, the predatory stillness that had replaced Ezra's smile. "Just clearing some roots," Thaddius said, his voice flat. He tried to sound casual, but the lie felt brittle in his mouth. Ezra took a slow step closer, his eyes never leaving the hole. "Roots," he repeated, savoring the word as if it were a joke. "Funny thing about roots. Sometimes you dig for one thing and find something else entirely, something you weren't meant to find." He looked up, his gaze meeting Thaddius's, and for the first time, Thaddius saw the man behind the mask. There was no warmth there, no neighborly concern. only a cold, ruthless vigilance. "I don't know what you're talking about, Ezra," Thaddius said, his hand moving instinctively closer to his holstered Colt. Ezra saw the movement. A thin, cruel smile touched his lips. "I think you do, Thaddius. I think your dog knew first. Animals are funny that way, aren't they? They can smell a secret a mile away." He gestured with his chin toward the grave. "You should have left it buried. Some things are better left in the ground." The air crackled with unspoken threat. The setting sun had abandoned the sky, leaving the world in a deep, blue-gray gloom. It was just the two of them now, standing over a makeshift grave, the pretense of civilization stripped away. Thaddius was no longer a grieving widower on his quiet ranch. He was a man who had unearthed a secret, and the keeper of that secret was standing 3 feet away, his hand hovering near the pistol on his own hip. The oppressive silence of the ranch had been broken, replaced by the humming tension of a standoff, and deep in the shadows, Pastor let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that promised violence. The quiet wrongness had a name now. It was Ezra, and Thaddius knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Ezra had not come to help him fill the hole back in. The world had shrunk to the space between the two men, a charged field of dust and dread. Thaddius could feel the cold weight of the Colt against his thigh, a grim counterpoint to the heat of Ezra's stare. Ezra's friendly mask had crumbled completely, revealing the bedrock of ruthless greed beneath. His eyes, fixed on the canvas-wrapped bundle in the shallow grave, held a possessive, hungry light. He had not come here by chance. He had been watching, waiting. "You should have stayed in your house, old man," Ezra said, his voice low and devoid of its folksy charm. "Should have trusted your gut when it told you to mind your own damn business." "This is my land, Ezra," Thaddius replied, his own voice a gravelly rasp. "What's buried in it is my business. Not anymore." Ezra took another half step, shifting his weight to the balls of his feet like a snake preparing to strike. That's a private matter, and you just trespassed." Thaddius didn't have to ask whose matter it was. The answer was in the cold sweat on his own brow, in the way Pastor's growl deepened into a chesty rumble. Ezra had put that body in the ground. The thought was so monstrous, so contrary to the image of the man who brought him stew, that it almost defied belief. Yet, the proof was right there, in the tightening of Ezra's jaw and the naked menace in his eyes. Before either man could break the fragile truce of inaction, a new sound intruded, sharp and unwelcome. More hoofbeats. Not one rider this time, but several, coming in fast from the north, their pace urgent, reckless. Both Thaddius and Ezra turned toward the sound, their personal conflict momentarily suspended by the arrival of a new, unknown variable. 3 riders crested the same low hill Ezra had, their forms dark and jagged against the star-dusted cobalt of the sky. They didn't slow as they entered the yard. They rode hard, pulling their horses to a skidding, dust-billowing halt that spoke of arrogance and impatience. The man in the lead swung down from his saddle before his horse had even stopped moving. He was younger than Thaddius, or Ezra, with a wild shock of dark hair and a cruel twist to his lips. He moved with a predatory swagger, his eyes sweeping the scene with a hot, angry glare. Behind him, 2 other men dismounted, leaner, quieter figures who moved with a synchronized, wolf-like economy. They fanned out, their hands already on their guns, their faces shadowed and grim. The leader's eyes landed on Ezra. "Crow!" He spat the name like a curse. "You son of a bitch! I knew you'd try and cut me out." Ezra's face went rigid, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his features before being replaced by a strained bravado. "Jesse, I wasn't expecting you to come calling." "Weren't you?" The man, Jesse, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You take my share, you bury the evidence, and you think I'm just gonna ride off into the sunset? You always were a damn fool, Ezra." Jesse's gaze shifted, taking in the scene with a sharp, tactical awareness. He saw Thaddius, The shovel, the open grave. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Well, well, looks like you had some help with your digging. Or did the old man get curious? The situation had mutated in an instant. It was no longer a tense standoff between two men. It was a chaotic, three-way confrontation. Thaddius was no longer just a witness. He was a loose end, a complication in a violent dispute he didn't understand. He was trapped between two factions of killers, his isolated ranch suddenly the epicenter of their blood feud. The feeling of dread solidified into a cold, hard certainty. He was not going to see the sunrise. He's got nothing to do with this, Ezra said quickly, trying to control a narrative that was rapidly slipping from his grasp. He was just digging. Jesse ignored him, his focus entirely on Thaddius. What's your name, old-timer? That's not your concern, Thaddius said, his hand now firmly gripping the handle of his Colt. Jesse's smile widened. Feisty. I like that. He took a step toward the grave, his henchmen mirroring his movement, their presence a suffocating pressure. He peered into the hole, his eyes glinting. So that's her. You didn't even give her a pine box, Ezra? That's cold, even for you. He looked back at Thaddius. He kill your wife, old man? Is that why you're digging her up? The question was a physical blow. Thaddius flinched, the casual mention of a wife hitting the raw, exposed nerve of his grief for Martha. Leave her out of this, he growled. So there was a wife, Jesse mused, his eyes alight with cruel curiosity. He was a man who enjoyed pulling the wings off flies. He turned his attention back to Ezra. The necklace, Ezra. Is it still on her? Ezra's face was a mask of fury and frustration. Of course it is. I buried her with it. Then you're a bigger fool than I thought, Jesse sneered. Now because of your shortcuts, we've got an audience. He nodded toward Thaddius. And audiences need to be dealt with. One of the wolf-like henchmen drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the still air. Thaddius drew his own gun in a smooth, practiced motion born of a long, hard life. The peacemaker felt like an extension of his will, a solid piece of reality in a world gone mad. Hold on, Jesse, Ezra said, raising a placating hand, his own gun now drawn and held low. There's no need for this to get messy. The old man doesn't know anything. We get what we came for and we ride out. He won't say a word. You think I trust your judgment? Jesse laughed again. You who thought burying your problems on some random dirt scratcher's land was a good plan. No, we clean up our messes, all of them. The truth of their conflict began to coalesce in Thaddius's mind from the fragments of their venomous exchange. Ezra and Jesse were partners. They had killed someone, the woman in the grave, for a necklace, a prize valuable enough to turn them against each other. Ezra had tried to hide the body and the prize, and Jesse had hunted him down to claim his share. And Thaddius Bell, a man who just wanted to live out his days in quiet sorrow, was standing squarely in the middle of their greedy, murderous mess. His ranch was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battleground. The disturbed earth at his feet was not just a grave, it was the treasure chest, and everyone here was willing to kill to be the one to open it. The necklace, Jesse repeated, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper as he looked at Ezra. It's mine. We had a deal. The deal changed when you got sloppy, Ezra shot back, his fear hardening into defiance. She was your mess to handle. She was our witness, Jesse snarled. And you were supposed to make sure she disappeared. Not just her, but everything she had on her. He gestured impatiently at the grave with his gun barrel. Get it, now! Ezra hesitated, his eyes darting between Jesse's gun and Thaddius's. He was caught, his careful plan unraveling into chaos. Thaddius felt a strange, cold calm settle over him. The fear was still there, a block of ice in his stomach, but it was overlaid with a grim resignation. He was not a young man. He had lived his life, loved his wife, and known a measure of peace. If this was his end, he would not meet it begging. He would meet it on his feet, on his own land. Nobody's touching that grave, Thaddius said, his voice ringing with an authority that surprised even himself. Jesse turned his head slowly, a look of theatrical disbelief on his face. "What did you say, old man?" "I said, stay away from it," Thaddius repeated, his aim steady. "You've brought your filth to my home. You've desecrated my land. You'll not compound the sin by robbing the dead, not while I'm breathing." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind picking up again, whispering through the eaves of the barn. Jesse stared at him, a new expression in his eyes. It wasn't amusement anymore. It was a flicker of respect, the kind one predator gives another just before the kill. "You hear that, boys?" Jesse said softly to his henchmen. "The old man has principles." He raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at Thaddius's chest. "That's a real shame. Principles get you killed in this world." The first shot did not come from Jesse. It came from Ezra. In a desperate, treacherous bid to regain control, he fired not at Thaddius, but at Jesse. The betrayal was instantaneous and absolute. The fragile standoff shattered, and the night exploded into a cacophony of gunfire. The world dissolved into a chaotic ballet of muzzle flashes and roaring thunder. Jesse, though surprised by Ezra's treachery, was fast. He twisted away as Ezra's shot tore through the air where his chest had been, the bullet thudding into the weathered planks of the barn. Jesse returned fire instantly, his shot wild but forcing Ezra to dive for the flimsy cover of a water trough. The two wolf-like henchmen reacted without hesitation, their pistols barking as they fired at Ezra, their former partner, now their primary target. Thaddius was momentarily forgotten in the maelstrom of internecine warfare. He used the precious second to drop and roll, the instincts of a long-ago rougher youth taking over. A bullet from one of Jesse's men whizzed past his head, splintering the corner of the barn behind him. He scrambled behind a stack of old fence posts, the rough wood digging into his back. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, a choking fog that burned his nostrils. From his new position, he could see the fight unfolding in brutal, staccato bursts of violence. Jesse was a whirlwind of motion, firing and moving, using his horse for cover. Ezra was pinned down, returning fire from behind the trough, water splashing from bullet impacts. The two henchmen advanced methodically, one moving to flank Ezra, while the other laid down suppressing fire. They were a practiced team of killers. Thaddius knew he was a dead man if he stayed put. He was outgunned, and once they finished with Ezra, they would turn on him. He had one chance, to make himself a harder target, to use his knowledge of this land, his land, against them. He peered through a gap in the fence posts, his Colt held in a two-handed grip. He saw one of the henchmen, the leaner of the two, breaking away, circling wide to get a clear shot at Ezra's back. The man was focused, his eyes locked on his prey. He was exposed. Thaddius took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The peacemaker bucked in his hand, the report a deep boom that was his own contribution to the hellish choir. The henchman cried out, a sharp, surprised sound, and stumbled, clutching a blossoming red stain on his thigh. He didn't go down, but his advance was halted, his flank attack ruined. The shot immediately drew Jesse's attention. "The old man!" he roared over the gunfire. The remaining henchman pivoted, his pistol spitting flame toward Thaddius's position. Splinters flew from the fence posts as bullets chewed into the wood just inches from Thaddius's head. He ducked low, the grim reality setting in. He had made his choice. He was no longer a bystander. He was in the war. And then, from the shadows near the porch, came a new sound. Not a gunshot, but a terrifying, deep-chested snarl of pure fury. Pastor. The dog, who had been a silent, quivering witness, launched himself into the fray. He wasn't the intuitive, fearful creature of the vigil anymore. He was a primordial force of loyalty and rage, a brindle streak of avenging muscle. He didn't attack the primary combatants. His focus, his righteous anger, was directed at the wounded henchman who was trying to limp back into cover. Pastor hit the man's wounded leg like a cannonball, his jaws closing with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, a high, panicked sound of pain and terror, and went down hard, his gun flying from his grasp. Pastor stood over him, a low, murderous growl vibrating through the ground, his teeth bared. The distraction was all Ezra needed. With Jesse's attention split and one henchman down, he rose from behind the trough, his face a mask of cold fury, and fired 2 quick, deliberate shots. The second henchman, the one who had been pinning Thaddius down, jerked backward as if punched, a look of vacant surprise on his face, before collapsing into a heap. Now it was just 3 men left standing, Thaddius, Ezra, and Jesse, and a very angry dog. Jesse, seeing his men taken out, let out a string of curses and fired his last shots toward Ezra, who ducked back behind the trough. The clicking sound of an empty cylinder followed. Jesse was out of bullets. He glanced wildly around, his eyes falling on Thaddius. With a snarl, he turned and sprinted for the flimsy cover of the open barn door, seeking darkness and a moment to reload. Ezra saw his chance. He stood up, taking careful aim at Jesse's retreating back. But Thaddius was faster. He couldn't let Ezra win this. He couldn't let the man who put a body in his yard be the last one standing. He fired at Ezra, not to kill, but to spoil his aim. His shot struck the dirt at Ezra's feet, making him flinch, and sending his own shot wide, punching a hole in the barn wall harmlessly. The brief moment of reprieve was deafening. The echoes of the gunfight died, leaving only the ragged sound of breathing and the whimpering of the wounded man Pastor was still guarding. In this sudden, tense quiet, Thaddius felt an overwhelming compulsion. The answer to everything, the reason for this bloodshed, was lying just feet away. He had to know who she was. He scrambled from behind the fence posts, his gun still trained on the trough where Ezra was hiding, and moved to the grave. His hands shook as he reached down and pulled at the rough canvas. It was stiff, stained with dirt and something darker. He pulled it back, revealing the still form within. The moonlight was just bright enough to illuminate the face. It was a woman, her features pale and waxen, her dark hair matted with dried blood. And Thaddius's world stopped. His breath hitched in his throat. He knew that face. It was older, etched with lines of worry he didn't recognize, but it was unmistakably her. Delilah Rhodes, his sister-in-law, Martha's younger sister. He hadn't seen her in 5 years, not since she'd left for the territories out west, chasing some story for a big city newspaper. She had been a firecracker, brave and stubborn, a woman who looked for truth in a world full of lies. And here she was, silenced, buried in a filthy hole on his land. The grief was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that was more painful than any bullet. This wasn't a stranger. This was family, Martha's family. A wave of white-hot rage, pure and cleansing, burned away his fear. This wasn't about his land anymore. This was about Delilah. His eyes fell on her neck. There it was, a thin silver chain. He reached down with a trembling hand and lifted the object hanging from it. It wasn't just a necklace. It was a locket, a small silver oval, tarnished with dirt. His fingers, clumsy with shock and rage, fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open. On one side, there was a tiny, folded piece of paper, stained and stiff. On the other side, protected by a small pane of glass, was a photograph. A faded miniature portrait of a younger Thaddius, taken by Martha on their wedding day, a silly grin on his face. Delilah had carried his picture. She had been coming to him, for help. "She came looking for you, you know." Ezra's voice, slick and triumphant, cut through his shock. He had risen from behind the trough and was walking slowly toward him, his gun leveled. "Came asking questions about her old man. The prospector I bought that worthless claim from years ago. Turns out he wasn't just a prospector. He'd struck silver. A whole damn vein of it. Kept it a secret. Drew a map." Thaddius looked up from the locket, the terrible truth crashing down on him. Delilah's father. Ezra hadn't just bought his claim. "The map was in a locket," Ezra continued, his voice dripping with venomous pride. "He wouldn't give it up, so I took it, but his nosy little girl wouldn't let it be. She came sniffing around, asking questions all over town. Found out about my deal with Jesse to work the mine. She was on her way here to you. Thought her brother-in-law, the big, strong rancher, could protect her. He laughed, a chilling, empty sound. I caught up with her on the trail just north of here. It was almost poetic, burying her on your land, the one place she thought she'd be safe. Behind Ezra, a shadow moved in the barn doorway. Jesse. He had reloaded. But he wasn't looking at Ezra. He was looking at the locket in Thaddius's hand. "That's not a map," Thaddius said, his voice hollow. He unfolded the tiny, blood-stained paper. It wasn't a map. It was a letter, written in Delilah's small, neat hand. A letter addressed to him. The full, monstrous scope of Ezra's evil was laid bare. He hadn't just killed a rival. He'd murdered a father for his discovery, and then murdered the daughter who came seeking justice. He had brought his crime to Thaddius's doorstep, turning his home into a tomb for his secrets. The violent catharsis was absolute. All the grief for Martha, all the fear and unease of the past weeks, all the horror of this night coalesced into a single point of cold, righteous fury. "You bastard," Thaddius whispered. Ezra smiled. "The world is run by bastards, Thaddius. The sentimental fools just end up in the ground." He started to raise his pistol for the final shot. But Pastor, who had been guarding his prisoner, saw the ultimate threat. With a ferocious roar that seemed to tear from the very earth, he launched himself again. He ignored Jesse, ignored the wounded man on the ground. His loyalty was singular. He flew across the yard and slammed into Ezra's side. The man cried out in pain and surprise as 40 pounds of canine fury and sharp teeth latched onto his gun arm. The pistol discharged, the shot going wild into the night sky. It was the only opening Thaddius would get. As Ezra screamed and tried to shake the dog off, Thaddius raised the peacemaker. He didn't hesitate. He didn't aim for an arm or a leg. He aimed for the center of the evil that had poisoned his world. He fired once. The shot was clean. Final. Ezra's eyes went wide, the cruel confidence draining out of them, replaced by a dull, final surprise. He staggered backward, his hand falling away from his arm where Pastor still clung, and collapsed beside the grave of the woman he had murdered. Justice, delivered with the help of a loyal dog, was finally done. Thaddius stood there, the heavy Colt smoking in his hand. Jesse, seeing his chance for the prize was gone and his enemy was dead, backed slowly into the darkness of the barn. A moment later, Thaddius heard the frantic sound of a horse being untied and the thunder of hoofbeats fading rapidly into the night. He let him go. The evil he needed to face was lying dead at his feet. The night fell silent once more, leaving only the wind, the whimpering of the wounded outlaw, and the profound, devastating quiet of the aftermath. The silence that descended was heavier than any that had come before. It was a vacuum, packed with the weight of death and revelation. The smell of gunpowder slowly gave way to the metallic tang of blood on the dry air. Thaddius stood over Ezra's body, the peacemaker still heavy in his hand, his arm trembling not from fear, but from the sheer, soul-shaking release of violent energy. Pastor let go of Ezra's arm and trotted to Thaddius's side, pressing his body against his master's leg, a warm, living anchor in the sea of carnage. The dog's low growl had ceased. His vigil was over. Thaddius looked at the scene around him. 2 of Jesse's gang were dead or dying. Ezra lay still, his eyes open to the indifferent stars. The 3rd outlaw, the one Pastor had taken down, was groaning, trying to drag his shattered leg. Thaddius walked over to him, his face a grim, unreadable mask. The man flinched, his eyes wide with terror. "Get on your horse," Thaddius said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "And tell your boss, Jesse, that if I ever see him again, I'll finish what we started tonight." The man, through grunts of pain, nodded frantically. With immense effort, he crawled to his horse, somehow managing to haul his broken body into the saddle. He rode away slowly, a wounded animal retreating into the darkness, leaving a trail of suffering in his wake. Now, they were truly alone. man, dog, and the dead. Thaddius holstered his pistol and knelt once more beside Delilah. The moonlight seemed to gather on her pale face, granting her a tragic marble peace. He looked from her still features to the locket still clutched in his hand. With infinite care, he opened it again and looked at the photo of himself, so young and unaware of the sorrow the future held. He had been her hope, a hope that had been extinguished just miles from his door. He gently worked the folded, blood-stiffened letter from behind the photo. His fingers, thick and calloused, felt sacrilegious, touching something so fragile. He unfolded it carefully under the moonlight. The ink was smeared in places, but Delilah's handwriting was clear. "Thad, I pray this letter finds you, though I fear I may not be the one to deliver it. If you are reading this, it means Ezra Crow succeeded. Please don't let him get away with what he's done. He murdered my father, not in a claim dispute, but in cold blood for the location of the silver lode Papa found in the Ghostwood Hills. The map was in a locket, Papa's locket. Crow took it, but he doesn't know the map is a cipher. Only I knew the key. He thinks it's just a piece of jewelry. I came here seeking justice. I uncovered Crow's partnership with an outlaw named Jesse. They were going to work the mine together. I have proof, affidavits from men in Silver Creek who he tried to hire, but they know I have the proof. Crow has been hunting me. I've been running for days. I am coming to you, Thad. I remember how you looked after Martha, how safe she felt. I know you are a good man, a strong man. I pray I can make it to the ranch. If I don't, please, avenge us, avenge my father. Let the truth be known. The world can't just be for men like Ezra Crow, your sister, Delilah." A single tear traced a path through the grime on Thaddeus's cheek and fell onto the letter, blurring the last words. He folded the paper with reverent slowness and tucked it into his shirt pocket, placing it against his heart. He understood everything now: the dog's terror, Ezra's veiled threats, Delilah's bravery. She hadn't been a victim cowering in fear. She had been an investigator, a warrior fighting for the memory of her father, armed with nothing but the truth. And she had paid for it with her life. He gently closed the locket, the silver cool against his skin. He slipped the chain from around her neck and held it tight in his fist. He could not give her justice in a courtroom, but he could give her honor. He could give her peace. He would not leave her in this shallow, profane hole. She deserved better. She deserved to rest beside her sister. The work that followed was a grim ritual. He ignored the bodies of the men who had brought this plague to his door. They could rot for the coyotes. His focus was singular. He hitched his sturdiest horse to Ezra's body and dragged it far out into the sagebrush, leaving it to the unceremonious justice of the wilderness. Then he returned to Delilah. He wrapped her gently but securely in a clean canvas tarp from the barn, his movements tender, his face set with a profound and terrible sorrow. He carried her slight form to the house and laid her on the spare bed, covering her completely. She would not spend another moment in the cold ground of her murder. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and rose, Thaddius took up his shovel again. He did not return to the defiled earth behind the barn. Instead, he walked up the gentle slope of the hill that overlooked the ranch, the place where the wind always seemed to speak most clearly. He walked to the simple wooden cross that marked Martha's grave, and beside it, he began to dig. The labor was his penance and his prayer. Each shovelful of earth was heavy with grief. He dug for Martha, whose memory had been violated. He dug for Delilah, whose courage had cost her everything. He dug for himself, for the quiet life that had been shattered. The sun climbed higher, baking the back of his neck, but he didn't stop. He worked through the morning, his movements rhythmic and relentless, his mind a quiet landscape of memory and loss. Pastor lay nearby, watching him, no longer haunted, but a quiet companion in his master's solemn task. When the grave was deep enough, he went back to the house. He carried Delilah in his arms up the hill, the weight of her a final, heartbreaking burden. He laid her to rest in the earth, placing her beside her sister, reuniting them in the silence of the land. He did not say any words. There were no words left. His actions were his eulogy. He filled the grave slowly, the sound of the soil falling on the canvas a soft, final whisper. When it was done, he took a piece of sturdy pine from the barn, the same wood he had used for Martha's cross, and fashioned another, simpler one. He carved one word into it: Delilah. He drove it into the fresh mound of earth. He then opened his hand and placed the silver locket on the grave, its metal glinting in the afternoon sun. A map to a treasure that had brought only death, now guarding the memory of a brave woman. The sun began its descent, mirroring the bloody sunset of the night before, but the colors felt different now. They were not angry, but somber, melancholic. The violence was over. The secrets were unearthed. Thaddius stood between the two graves, a silent guardian of the sisters. The wind whispered through the grass, and this time it did not sound lonely. It sounded like peace. He turned and walked back down the hill to his small, quiet house. Pastor fell into step beside him, his head held high, his gait easy and relaxed for the first time in weeks. The dog's vigil was ended. Thaddius sat on the porch step, the wood warm from the day's sun, and watched the shadows lengthen across the land. The ranch was forever changed, soaked in blood and memory, but it was his. The graves on the hill were not a mark of defeat, but a testament to love and loyalty, a testament to a truth that refused to stay buried. A hard-earned, somber peace settled over the haunted land, built one splinter, one scar, and one grave at a time. And in the great vast quiet, Thaddius Bell sat and watched the stars come out, no longer alone.